order of business will be to have our clerk call the roll.
Kurth, Gora, Natoli.
Here. We're going to have the usual sound problems.
Johnson.
Here. Very funny.
Dickinson. Fargo.
Here.
Nilo.
Here.
Jones.
Here.
Shelby.
Here.
Cullen.
Oh, here. And I said here before. Who did you call?
Natoli. We have a quorum.
Okay.
Thought you heard Colin early, number 3, whoever that was.
Diane. Mr.
Okay.
Pillsbury is sitting in for Mr. Clark.
My apologies, Mr. Pillsbury.
Here.
Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. We're glad that we have considerably more than a quorum. That's great. So glad to have everyone here this afternoon. This commission meeting is actually being cablecast live on Metro Cable 14, the Government Affairs channel, on the cable system. It's going to be repeated on Saturday, August 28th at 12 noon. And this is a special meeting that was called by the Cable Commission for a staff presentation on our franchising and license transfer process, history and process. And so with that, we are going to turn this over to our staff.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. I hope you were able to cut your way through the air and make it over without too much hassle. The only action item we have for today is to cancel the meeting schedule, the regular meeting schedule for next Thursday. So I'd recommend that before we possibly have a quorum shortage, we address that. The next regular scheduled meeting would be the first Thursday in October. If we had a reason for meeting next week, I would so advise, but we do not.
Okay, so the first action item we have then before our board is to adopt the resolution which will be canceling our September 2nd, 1990. Okay, moved and seconded.
Second.
Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you. And then our next meeting will be in October, correct?
That's correct. In June, you asked staff to provide you with 3 things: some information on history, process, and issues related to the franchise and the franchise transfer. So this is a staff presentation. We are not under a transfer process now. No transfer has been filed with us. But the reports in the journal and in the trades is generally public information that Comcast will be swapping a series of systems throughout the country with AT&T. I believe that those transfers will follow closure of the Media One buyout by AT&T. And as AT&T has purchased all of Media One, that process has extensive federal review as well as local reviews. Right now, a key element of the federal review is a requirement from the FCC that no cable operator can amass 30% of the subscriber audience. And if AT&T acquires Media One, they will be over that 30%. The FCC is supposed to consider that issue on the 15th of September, or was supposed to. As of today, AT&T is asking that it be postponed because they don't like the staff recommendation that was raised yesterday. The point being that it may be a while, may not be in 1999, and may not be, and more likely would be sometime next year before a formal transfer process is before you. So this is information, but we're not actively in that process. This would be a public hearing and a lot more aspects tied to it. In this briefing today, I will address history issues and some flavor, I hope, that puts some of this in perspective. Harriet will address the process aspects from the legal context, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about issues relative to the transfer as we close, some of the broader things that we'll be looking at when the transfer comes about. On the panel behind you, and it's okay to turn and have a look, we've gone to our institutional archives, and we're letting the Bee and the Union, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times tell our story and put in perspective, kind of using this as the raw data and working backwards to some of the themes that have followed this Cable Television Commission. So the franchise wars in 82, 83, what we refer to as round 1, came about when United Tribune Cable was picked as the franchisee. And that then triggered some celebration. There were certainly some bidding wars. and then a process of negotiation for about 5 months where the tentative selectee or the tentative franchisee, the selectee, went through a process of bringing their documents into a contractual form. And as you see on the right side of round one, that failed. Highlighted there in green, the cable TV pact with United Tribune Cable, now called dead. That entity, United Tribune, after being offered the franchise and having gone through a series of 5 months of negotiation, failed to accept it. And one of the reasons they failed to accept it, and you'll see there in the headlines, is the issue of guarantee of where the liability will hang for failures to complete or provide the services and all the elements of the cable franchise. So round two of the cable franchising began in '83. We went out to a rebid. It took about another year, and the process started all over again. At the end of that process, Cablevision, another company that had competed the first time, was selected. And so you see there in 1983, Cablevision wins the pact, and there was again some celebration. That process went a little bit differently because we got a little smarter. Instead of awarding the franchise based on a lot of discussion and, if you will, hype, we put the contract out with the RFP, with the request for bids. And we asked the respondents to take the contract and, with insert strikeout language, tell us exactly what they would agree to. I'll make a little side note. Sacramento is famous among the cable television industry and the regulatory critics, if you will, and in Congress for this issue of 20,000 trees. United Tribune Cable, as one of the incentives for the elected officials to award the franchise to them, promised, with quotes, to plant 20,000 trees in our community. When the negotiating team, made up of some of you and a group of attorneys, a large group of attorneys, began to specify that. That is, what kind of trees, where will they be planted, who will maintain them. The point being that if this is a factor upon which we will base the award of the franchise, then it must be real. That has been turned around now in the history, the verbal history primarily, but it actually is in the congressional record, that the requirement for trees was a requirement of your body, that you required as a condition of the franchise that they plant the trees, not the other way, that they offered and then we tried to put it in place. In 1984, we had kind of an oops, and at that time, Cablevision, who was the franchisee, ran out of cash. They had a minority partner called Scripps Howard, and so Cablevision left, and Scripps Howard became the franchisee in late 1984. So there had been a little bit of ground dug, and some work begun, but nothing of great significance. They didn't have the deep pockets to build our system as it was spec'd in the time frames, along with their other commitments. So Scripps Howard stepped in 85, 86, as you can see. We got some smiles for a while, and construction was moving along quite quickly. You may remember, for those of you that are around, your front yards being dug up and some of the other issues that went on through that process. But in 85, 86, and then coming down to this panel, in 87, services actually started to be rolled out. People were being turned on, and it was beginning to move forward. And I use the term same old here across the bottom because we went through a series then of ups and downs, of good times and bad times. It seemed like the bad times came at Christmas on 3 or 4 years in a row. And the process of narrowing the commitments of the franchise began, and that's a theme that I'll come back to. So we see in 87 some various issues happening with the community programming entities not being funded, with the cable company having told you very strongly that they would have a $2 entry tier as an incentive for low income, as a service for low income, and then they didn't market it. We couldn't find it when we went out to see if you could sign up for it. We were told it didn't exist. In 87 and 88, we see where there's, the fourth, fifth, and sixth rate increases, sometimes 2 in a year, so a pattern was being established there. Customer service became an issue in 88 and 89 with phones not being answered and a response by your board to implement what then were the first 2 or 3 set of cable television regulations in the country. Later on, the FCC adopted a base standard of cable television regs, and they used 10 sets from throughout the country from local governments as models, and ours was one. In 90, there was, I'll jump back here. I'm leaving out the lawsuits. I'll get to those in a second. But I can say from 93 to the present, we've had relatively smooth sailing. There has only been 1 new lawsuit since 89, one coming at us, one which we were successful and on appeal. So that we've seen now some transfers and some other issues, but relatively calm flying since then. So Eiko, if you switch that's the one. If you'd raise that, that's great.
The other one back.
And maybe put the front one down. And within the history of the franchise here, we can't disregard lawsuits. I say in presentations to anybody who will listen that we probably are the cable television litigation capital of the world. Early on, there were some 16 suits that challenged our franchising authority, that set some precedents, or we were part of some precedents being set nationwide. In that middle panel, in 87, we sued and were countersued twice with the cable company in the same year, again around Christmas time, where we went after various problems and issues regarding the commitments of the franchise, failure to provide, failure to meet, failure to do, et cetera, et cetera. And that was overlaid by issues at the national level in terms of our lawsuit being one of 7 on a national basis. In 89 and early 90, all of those were settled, and there's a clip there that I think on the right panel under lawsuits highlighted in green that your commission shelled out $6 million to make $160 million of potential liabilities go away. So the flavor of our history is one of navigating through a minefield of lawsuits. The last 2 panels, but certainly not least, that reflect, I think, some of the values that your commission has held. One has been for community programs and community programming. We've had some issues about the content of programming, but I think what you'll see from the panels and what you need to know is that we value very highly, very strongly community programming. We've gone to lots of efforts to be probably one of the best, put more resources into community programming than mostly any other entity in California and probably on the West Coast. So we have a high value for community programming that continues as we speak. On affirmative action and wages, there was some interesting elements in the original franchise. 1, there was a very, very strong affirmative action plan with extensive monitoring. And 2, there was a very strong prevailing wage rate program that we monitored as well. The affirmative action program still exists, although it's been capsulized or narrowed a bit, and it is on your agenda today for some report back. It's more of a oversight rather than a very assertive affirmative action plan. And the prevailing wage program, which was a requirement that there be not Davis-Bacon, but prevailing wages for the construction activity of the cable television build, was negotiated out in the 87 lawsuit. So that reflects what the media shows as I think some of the values or some of the assets that come through. You'll see that, again, there have been tremendous ups and downs, and the last few years have been fairly stable. Feel free to look and poke as time goes, as our meeting goes on, or we can leave these up after the meeting for a bit. But that's historic background, kind of capsule summary over the last 18 years or so. Some of the themes that we go forward to, or what I've tried to draw from this, are major themes and primary elements, if you will, of what we look for, or what you have looked for historically. But let me put a couple of things in perspective and frame it a bit. The cable system cost about $200 million to build, and these are round numbers, probably cost twice that now. Based on the numbers reported in the trades, the system's now worth $1 billion. You have approximately 250,000 subscribers, something in the 50 to 55% range of eligible dwelling units in our community take cable service. The cable company grosses about $130 million a year, and something in the range, and this is based on industry financial type statistics, something in the range of $50 or $60 million leaves Sacramento. By my count, there have been 6 general managers since I've been here, and I got up close to about 100 attorneys and stopped tracking. But this has been a interesting experience from the legal standpoint. Point being, this is not an insignificant operation, and as this transfer goes forward with AT&T, or if and when this transfer goes forward, AT&T will have a system, quite possibly based here in Sacramento, that will include Yuba, Sutter, Roseville, Sacramento, some of El Dorado, some of Placer County, some of San Joaquin County, all centralized here, or very close to here. The issues of competition, of providing telecommunication services to our community and the region are all very much interrelated into what you can do or what can be done with economies of scale in this telecommunications revolution. There's no questions. I'm going to use the PowerPoint now on what I think are the key concepts. So if we could drop the screen, Bill or Diane. As I backed up from this and try to bring to you some major premises for under the category of history, I think there are 2, and they go back to 1979 and 80. One is aggregate. The reason that you represent multiple jurisdictions here is that you decided to put the city of Sacramento, the county of Sacramento, Folsom and Galt, and now Citrus together for the purposes of awarding, negotiating, bidding your cable television franchise. Other counties, Contra Costa has 12 or 15 different cable television franchises in 2 or 3 different companies. LA is up in the 30s. San Francisco just has 1. But your public policy decision was to work together. And my memory isn't real sharp at that period in time, but I think you set example for other things, for cross-jurisdictional activities to work together. So by aggregating, the concept in aggregating was that there would be the potential for better benefits to the community. And some of the things you did end up with are 7 community channels and some other, many other things that don't exist now that did exist then. But aggregating, working together was one clear concept going backward. It applies to Channel 14 as well. By sharing Channel 14, the smaller cities within your jurisdiction have access to more resources than they would have otherwise. The other aspect of it was the aggregation, was that you made a decision to actively manage or have active oversight of the cable television franchise. That's why you have a staff and this entity exists. The elected officials at the time had traveled throughout the country and had learned from the experience that once the franchise wars were over, once the franchise had been issued, the follow-through was critical to not having your phones ringing about problems with the cable system of fuzzy picture and all the rest of the things that went along. So you looked at, by aggregating, you looked at having the economic base and the commitment to manage the franchise. When the franchise is a contract, again, the experience that had been learned by the elected officials was, in too many cases, the franchise was awarded, the documents were negotiated, and then there wasn't any follow-through. Your predecessors, or some of your predecessors, and I and a few of you were around at the time, said that, no, we will have a contract. It will be a legal binding document with as much enforceability and provisions that allow us to make the commitments happen. So those were 2 overriding concepts I saw within all this documentation and within all the history. A quick couple of words about what may be the results of all this and where we are, and then I'll get into some of the details of more specific franchise issues. Result-wise, one possible result is that Mayor Eisenberg might have been correct. Remember his quote? Mayor Eisenberg refused to participate in the franchising process, equating it roughly to a pitcher of warm spit. So he wasn't too excited about all this.
That's why we didn't remember it, Rich.
Two, we have some
But he
very
did participate.
yeah, we have some very complicated documents, and it's why we keep our legal counsels busy. We have a franchise ordinance that's about that thick, a licensing ordinance that's about that thick, and an amended and restated franchise resolution, which together, the franchise documents are about that thick. They include the certificate of acceptance and a couple of other things that are tabbed for you in your packet today. Where it gets complicated is the amended and restated franchise resolution has this neat language. It says, the commission finds and determines that is necessary and appropriate to make inapplicable the franchise ordinance to the franchisee unless it says otherwise here. This is in the license ordinance. And then it lists a few here under this section 6.01, and then a few other places in the document it lists a few more that aren't applicable. And then it gives us a few that are. So one of the results we have is a mixed mash of documentation that takes some expertise to filter through, and to the novice it can be quite confusing. Some other results, lawsuits and renegotiation of commitments. One of the things that pains me the most is that the original franchise document in 82, 83 would have made this community the first wired community in the country, probably the world. This was before the internet was ever heard of. But there was to be a second cable system, an institutional network called at the time, but really now would be called a municipal area or community area network, that was to go to every school and every public facility in the county. This was about 5 miles of that was installed, and the lawsuits hit, and it was negotiated out. But we would have had a jump, and a jump on the future at the time. So there's a history of commitments not being held, or held to. A role by you as a result of the litigation to stimulate, not impede competition. Early on, the thought was that we would like to protect and be a partner with our franchisee as a way of keeping and maximizing the community benefits. As time went on and the court decisions, it evolved that we were necessitated, we necessarily had to go to a different level. And we've had since 88 now a licensing ordinance, and I say jokingly, but I think it's almost true. You can get a cable television license in this county faster than you can get a driver's license. So we've gone to a posture of supporting competition. In fact, you have issued a series of competing cable television licenses, almost all of which have never turned a shovel full of dirt or became realistic. Another concept or a result was that what little authority granted to local governments on cable television at the federal and state level there was available, staff has recommended in most cases, and you have used. So when you tell your constituents, or when your constituents say, how come this and how come that, I can fairly safely advise you that there's not much more you can do on rate regulation, on customer service regulation, on monitoring construction, all the things that you had authority to use, you've used. And finally, as I mentioned before, there's a real result of having made sacrifices along the way for community programming. That's something that you valued quite highly. So those are big picture results, concepts. Some specific things now that will hopefully we'll be looking for, you'll be looking for, I'd like you to be looking for, as we move into a transfer process, is enforceability. In your binders, there's some tabs, 2 tabs if you would, and I think Harriet may come back to it, but tab 4 is the corporate guarantee. One of the things that made United Tribune walk in 1982 was the level to which the corporate parent would guarantee the obligation, the agreed upon commitments of the franchise. And what you have now, and tab 4 shows that, is a guarantee of Comcast Corporation, not Comcast Cable, not any subsidiary, but the top corporate dog, is guaranteeing to you all the faithful performance, and you can read all those words, of all the obligations of the franchise in Sacramento. So enforceability is something that you have valued quite highly. What was learned in the franchising wars was that the word intends isn't real. We look for the words will. Intends is words without meaning. Likewise, cable company comes to you and says, we will, one of the results is you'll have this and you'll have this and you'll have this. Unless it's definable, a definable deliverable with an enforcement provision, like we asked the question, what happens if you don't? We have to discount, or we've learned to discount, the validity of that particular offering. So enforceability is one that, and Chairperson Collin is nodding here with me because we've been through this before. Second important is continued support for community programming. Third, and this is one where other jurisdictions have fallen behind, but I'll report that the system design and capability was heavily negotiated with an engineering team and then monitored. You had engineers monitor the actual physical construction. We reviewed permits to be sure that what went into the ground was a cable system, a telecommunications system, for which the quality of service was built in. There were examples of different electronics being placed in different ways in other jurisdictions. So you looked at system design, technical capacity, and then monitored that. And that's one of the reasons I think we have very few complaints about reception quality. We get a few, but not many, and that's because of your focusing on that particular issue. This also has to do with looking forward to what capabilities a new telecommunications system or cable system would have. Third was the financial capability. And we looked at this, we actually got somewhat taken aback by it with the Cablevision process in 1984. Cablevision came through, our financial people said, yes, they have the wherewithal and the dollars to build a system here and all the issues. But what we did know was how many other systems Cablevision would win. They won Boston and Manhattan and a few other places, Long Island, all at the same time. And they didn't have the financial ability for the totality. So this is why we have provisions for bonding. There were concerns at one level of the system getting started, some homes being turned on and not being able to complete, and all the issues of equity and inequity and how that can work. There were issues of again, quality, et cetera. So financial capability is one that you've held near and dear. We've also managed the construction. This is in part inspecting the construction to be sure that the electronics going in are the ones we had agreed to. But this was also a social aspect, that you established a census tract progression. So we looked at our community among census tracts and the economic breakdown, and we essentially randomized within 3 levels so that from a public policy perspective, there weren't any favoritism. As it worked out, just as a luck of the draw in how it was, there became a big flap about Oak Park getting behind in construction at one particular point. But it wasn't because you hadn't tried to address that process. It was just that just happened to be where they got behind. We took care of that, or you took care of that at the time. Some other aspects here are pedestals, those things in the front yard. We looked at those. We certainly don't like those things. But our engineering advice was that they were necessary given the high water table and the lawn sprinklers. And so engineering-wise, we had to deal with that. You adopted the first set of pedestal regulations in the country that requires notice, required the cable company to provide trees, bushes, and shrubs, and or to allow the homeowner to relocate the pedestal to a different location off their easement, but on their property for aesthetic purposes. So we got in at that level. The third level, and one that I was involved in, was that we also helped the cable company expedite their construction. So staff ran point person with public works inspectors, the utility inspectors across the board, so that the construction process could move as quickly as possible. Again, having made the decision to award the franchise and get it moving, we worked actively to make it happen. With a space, the affirmative action prevailing wage is an important element, but it's one that is restricted or narrowed to where it was some time ago. So that's an overview of our history from a chronological perspective, a summary of a couple of key points, aggregate and the franchise as a contract. And then these elements come through from your history of things that have been important as we've managed this process along the way. The transfer process, and I'm going to pass the ball here to Harriet in a second, and I'll drive the mouse for it. The transfer process is interesting in that you have an ordinance which is quite specific relative to system transfer. Many other jurisdictions have very broad language and rely on the federal language, which is not preemptive but must work together. So I'll Harriet walk you through now, and you did get a memo, I believe that's tab 2 from last time. Check that. In your tab 2 is the memo that was distributed to you in June, which is your legal counsel's review of the process for the franchise transfer. Harriet, you got the ball.
Okay, if my voice gives out, I'm going to blame it on the smoke that's outside, because somehow that seems to be really getting to me. The transfer process is a combination of federal law and your ordinance, and I'm just going to try to go through it. You have it in more detail in the memo that you got last time. And some of you have been through the process before, and for others it would be brand new. I think I'd like to start by saying that, in the world of cable franchises, there are transfers and there are renewals. And they're very, very different. And I think first I would like to set the two concepts up. What transfer is your cable franchisee saying, we want to sell this system to somebody else. And in that's the context, that's what we're discussing today. That decision to sell the franchise doesn't trigger a renegotiation of the basic terms of the franchise. What it triggers is a determination of whether the new person who's going to be running the franchise has the wherewithal to run the franchise, and what the impacts on the existing franchise are solely by reason of the transfer. It's very different from a renewal. In a renewal context, your franchise, which has a term, and in Sacramento that term goes to 2024, so none of us will be around, I don't think, except maybe Rich, when we get to the renewal. But in a renewal context, everything is up for grabs pretty much. I mean, it's a renewal of a new franchise for a new term. And, as circumscribed by federal law, the local entities and the cable operator get together and figure out what the terms of the franchise will be for the future. That is not what we're going to be doing. What we're going to be doing, assuming we get an application in, is deciding whether or not the franchise should be sold from Comcast to AT&T. And the process, the first part of this process is triggered by the filing of a federal Form 394. And just for fun, since I'm looking at the ones up in Sutter and Yuba County, I brought one. And if anybody wants, this is the one for Marysville. It's very pretty and it has about a ream of paper in it. And it's probably smaller than a lot of them because this franchise was renegotiated and is brand new. I mean, the renewal was finished less than 6 months ago. And so a lot of the little quirks were ironed out at that point. This is a very straightforward transfer, but you still get a lot of paperwork. What the 394 does is it's a form that pretty much says, gives you all the major terms for the transfer. And the FCC tried to lay out the things that local government would want to know as part of the transfer. And the first thing that happens, and the first thing we did when the Scripps Comcast transfer occurred, was the staff, Rich and I, looked at the application to determine whether or not it was complete. So whether it gave your commission staff and yourselves sufficient information to be able to act on the franchise, to know whether or not the transfer, whether or not you could go forward because you had the information to make that decision. The last time, the Scripps Comcast transfer, we found that the 394 was not complete. It didn't tell you enough information to be able to judge what you need to judge. And so the reason it's important to determine whether it's complete is federal law says from the time you get a complete 394, you have 120 days to decide whether or not to approve the transfer. If you don't act in that 120 days, it's deemed approved. So you're on a very, very tight time schedule once you get a complete 394. And you're also on a very tight time schedule to make sure you determine whether or not that filing is complete or not. Because if you just sit on it and then, a month or two later say, oh my God, it's not complete, then you start to run into timing problems. And this is a very process-oriented process, I guess. And so first you get the 394, and then generally speaking, your staff has assessed it and told the cable company whether or not we believe it to be complete. That process can involve the commission or not. That's the commission's choice. In the past, it's been primarily a staff evaluation, and if we had a problem, we would have brought it to the commission. Thereafter, what the staff has done is analyze the transfer against the criteria in your local ordinance. So you go from the federal process of mandating the 120-day time frame and the filing of a form to your own local ordinance. And as I put down in the memo that you have, what your ordinance says is the cable company has the burden to prove by clear and convincing evidence that it could transfer based on the criteria. And there are 6 criteria that you look at. And those criteria basically go with whether the new operator has the reputation and the integrity and the reliability equal to the existing operator, whether they have the financial capability of the existing operator, whether or not there's the potential for an increase in rates, whether the existing franchisee is in compliance with the franchise, and if not, how is that going to be corrected before or as part of the transfer, whether the installation of the cable system is complete. Now, you may think that's a no-brainer because it was built a long time ago. The last time we did a transfer, they were in the middle of an upgrade. And so we really had a system that wasn't complete because it was in the middle of being upgraded. And so that's an issue that can arise even though the system has been here for a long time. And then the last criteria is basically whether or not the transaction will detrimentally affect the public interest. And what staff has done is we've looked at what the cable operator and the potential new operator has given to the staff and evaluated that to determine whether we could make a recommendation to the commission as to whether you could make those findings. And that process was very intense last time we did it. It went on for quite a while. And during that process, and mandated by your ordinance, you conducted at least one public hearing to get public testimony on whether or not the franchise transfer met the criteria in your ordinance. And what we brought back to you during that process was a transfer resolution which had all of the proposed findings and the evidence that supported those findings. And to the extent that there were things that the new operator had promised to do to make sure you could meet those findings, they were incorporated as conditions of the transfer. And that ended up being this, which was the transfer resolution, which I'm not sure how many pages it ended up being, but it was quite a lot. And this document is a legal document approved by your board. At the time Comcast actually acquired the system, they had to sign that they agreed with and would comply with all the terms of your franchise and all of the terms in the transfer resolution. And that was what completed the process. Now, I mean, as part of that process, as I said, it's a very time-intensive process because of the federal time deadlines. It's a process that requires public hearing, and it's a process that requires a lot of analysis and paperwork to make sure that you're not giving up what you have and that what you get is what you think you're getting when a new operator comes in. The decision of the Cable Commission is final. It's up to you to decide whether or not you can make the findings. And then just because we, as Rich keeps saying, we're the litigation capital of America, those findings are subject to judicial review. So if this commission were to determine that you couldn't make those findings and therefore you could not approve the transfer to whoever, the cable operator would be able to bring that decision to court to determine whether or not your decision was reasonable or not.
Excuse me, okay. Tab 5 is the transfer resolution from 3 years ago. That's the Scripps to Comcast transfer. And there's several dozens of times where staff is prepared to provide you with this finding is based on, and then we've listed all the evidence that was submitted that we thought was, that staff felt was supportive of the finding. That process meant that the cable company and the proposed cable company had to provide that evidence, and there was lots of discussion and you know, refining and several processes that were involved. We felt at the time that this was a very potent document.
Right.
Very convincing.
Yeah. I wanted to, most of the time, or many times when public agencies look at projects or decisions, when you're in the land use context and you're looking at development permits, you're looking at whether there's substantial evidence in the record to support your decision. When you adopted the cable franchising ordinance, you determined that you would approve transfers only if you could make the findings by clear and convincing evidence. And that's a much higher burden than what you use in many of your other decision-making roles. And I just thought I would go through just real quickly. I went to the jury instructions, because that's where you see most of these things all the time. And I thought I'd just bring sort of a definition of clear and convincing proof so that you could sort of put that in the back of your mind for when this, when and if this happens. And what the courts have said is that clear and convincing proof means that it's clear and explicit and unequivocal. It's so clear as to leave no substantial doubt, and it's sufficiently strong to demand the unhesitating assent of every reasonable mind. So it's not beyond a reasonable doubt. I mean, this is not criminal context, but it's more than just more likely than not. It's more than just, well, there is some evidence here, and therefore we could go forward. Your ordinance says that you should have clear and convincing evidence that the transfer meets the criteria. And that it's the burden of the cable operator, not your burden and not your staff's burden, but the burden of the cable operator to bring that evidence forward. Just as a fast aside, I think the last time we did a transfer, we did it when rate regulation was in place. And one of the major issues when we looked at the transfer was the criteria that talked about whether or not the transfer would result in an increase in rates. And at that point, what you looked at and what you approved was a resolution that said, pretty much in light of rate regulation, rates can only go up, basic tier rates and the full basic package can only go up based on the formulas that were in place from the FCC. And Comcast agreed as part of the transfer that they wouldn't gross up the system, that they wouldn't take advantage of the ability to include their purchase price into those rate formulas. And so therefore the rates basically went on under rate regulation as if there had been no change. And so you were able to make a finding that there would be no impact on rates. Today there is no rate regulation. And so Comcast has the ability to put rates at where Comcast believes the rates would be. When you go to transfer, there is no rate regulation. So how we decide, how they bring forward evidence and how the commission looks at whether or not the proposed transfer to AT&T will or won't have an impact on rates, I think will be one of the more interesting parts of the transfer process. So one of the issues, maybe you want to go on to. I'm learning how to do this. Even lawyers have to become technologically efficient, but Rich is still pushing the buttons over there. So the first issue, one of the issues that will come to the commission is whether the clear and convincing thresholds have been met so that you can approve the transfer. The next issue is going to be whether or not the terms in those documents are real. Are they enforceable? And Rich touched upon that before. We're looking both sort of retrospectively at whether the existing franchise is in full compliance with the terms of the franchise, and if not, how they're going to fix that. And prospectively, to the extent that they have to make any commitments to you in order for you to meet the threshold requirements to approve the franchise, are those commitments real and are they enforceable? And I think it will be up to Rich and up to me to make sure that what we draft and what we recommend to you does have enforceability behind it, because without that, the document just isn't worth anything to you and you can't really rely on it. So, I think it's important from all sides to make sure that you have an enforceable transfer when that occurs. And that brings up the guarantee. Right now, you have a guarantee, a full, unequivocal guarantee from Comcast. That guarantee was originally executed by Scripps, and it was done because Scripps wanted to restructure its corporations and how its parent corporations related to its subsidiary corporations. When it decided to restructure, you had two franchisees. You had several, but there were two that were relevant. Both were Scripps corporations. One was local and one was national. And that national corporation was publicly traded. It had all of the trappings of a publicly traded corporation. It was not the full parent corporation. What Scripps wanted to collapse those corporations so that your franchise would no longer be held in part by a publicly traded corporation. And at that point, this commission said that they would not accept that was unacceptable because it changed the quantum of financial capability behind the franchise. And in order to go through with their corporate reorganization, Scripps agreed to and did provide a corporate guarantee from the parent corporation so that you still had a publicly traded corporation that had all of the trappings of a publicly traded corporation and all of the financial wherewithal of a publicly traded corporation obligated under your franchise. When Comcast acquired the cable franchise, they too signed a corporate guarantee from their parent corporation. And that was one of the most difficult portions of the negotiations for the transfer, because originally Comcast said, you can't mean that. You don't really have that. We will, our franchise, the holder of the franchise is going to be this Comcast over here. And we said, no, you can hold it. However, we want an entity to hold it that has some financial backing, but we won't give up the guarantee. That's the basic underlying structure of the franchise. That's how we know that if something goes wrong on the local level, we can go and have it fixed. And that is likely to be the major issue in any transfer of this system, because it's the functional equivalent of, the AT&T, and we can go to 57th Street or wherever in Manhattan and go visit them and say, here's our corporate guarantee. And that's very different than almost any other franchise in this area. I can't think of another franchise, another local group of local entities that has a corporate guarantee like that backing up their franchise. And to us, as to be able to administer the franchise, it's a very, very important tool to have, and one that I think will be key in determining whether or not you can approve a transfer, is whether you have the same the same level of entity owning and being obligated on the system after that you had before.
Take these.
Okay. You want to talk about these first?
Yeah, but that's within our hour here. We're getting right there. As we look forward to the transfer process, what might be some other issues that will be be addressing. We have a very broad gross revenues definition in our franchise and our license and the amended and restated franchise resolution. But we still need to be refining that relative to new services coming on or being available on cable systems. So will there be fees paid to the jurisdictions as a result of new services? Same thing applies to customer service. We have some what I think, very good basic customer service standards. Will they and how will they be applied to the new services being provided? Other cable companies rolling out their internet services have agreed that the cable television customer services, where applicable, the fuzzy picture isn't something that applies to an internet connection, will apply. Another one that's very active right now and lots of fun, has lots of aspects to it, and I've discussed this with a few of you, is this issue called OpenNet. And right now, that is that as the cable industry comes forward, and primarily AT&T, to roll out their internet service, they're rolling it out essentially as an exclusive service, so that if you subscribe to or you want internet service over the cable, the connection and the internet service provider are one, both provided by AT&T. The system doesn't, or their contract and their methodology right now, doesn't provide for another entity to provide connectivity or internet connection, internet services on the cable system itself. The subtopic of this is whether or not cable systems should have to be unbundled. This has been quite active in Portland, court cases pending, in Los Angeles, San Francisco, in Florida, and some other places. There's legislation pending in this city. There's legislation discussed at the federal level. The FCC has dabbled with the issue as well. This is a very interesting, and could be a very intriguing issue to get to. My feeling and advice to you is I would hope that we could get through our criteria first, which to me are much stickier, much more difficult, and we address what's in our ordinance first and our own requirements before we move into some of the more recent, more contemporary issues that are evolving with this telecommunications revolution. So in summary, unless you got more to add? In summary, you have a history of certain premises and factors that you have demonstrated by your actions are important to the cable television franchise and license. And we have, on the going forward basis, some other things that may come into play. The challenge will be moving all this within 120 days from when it starts. It's 2 o'clock. This concludes what we had planned for our staff briefing, and we can probably bring the lights up and answer any questions.
Okay, and that's what we'll do first, since when we scheduled this meeting, we did it mainly for the staff to make the presentation and for board members, if they had questions, to ask at this point.
It seems like nothing. We don't have to worry about anything until the 394
That's
gets
correct.
here. Okay.
Yes.
Just a couple of questions. In looking at the past, the ordinance and that was submitted to us, there was a question that I had. It relates to the affirmative action, better word now is equal opportunity. This was part of the original franchise, right? And now the monitoring, the city is doing that. My question, let me get to my question is, why wasn't a contract provision included? So if not only is hiring people good business, but also contracts that are awarded by the cable franchise were not included.
Let's raise the screen.
Yeah.
You can, or Bill, if you'd raise the screen from the back.
Thank you.
Mr. Shelby, there were extensive provisions for contracting as well, and you'll see on the top right panel some of the lawsuits and issues that were addressed over there at the time, or over the time because of that. It surfaces 3 or 4 times in our chronological history. The bottom line was that the relatively thorough, complex aspects of EEOC staffing and contracting was negotiated out in the second lawsuit of 1987. So as part of those negotiations, there was a $15.3 million payment by the cable company. There was a waiver of franchise fees and a conversion to settlement fees at half the regular rate. The franchise extended from 20 to 40 years. The community programming responsibility shifted from the company to the public, on down the list. One of the things that was squeezed down was the EEOC affirmative action component, including the contracting. You'll see in your next item where Mr. Fleming from the city will be reporting the scope of what we have available to us now under the most recent evolution of this process.
So the contract monitoring was pretty well negotiated out of that?
That's correct. As well as the staff, the commission staff, who were half-time assigned to do that.
So that could be a negotiation.
Theoretically, but not within the structure, as Harriet tried to explain. That's a concept that would be applicable in a renewal. We're not going through a renewal. This is a transfer. So we don't usually in a transfer get in at that level. And we try and keep as distinct a renewal, essentially a reissuance of the franchise versus a transfer from one entity, one operating entity to another.
How do we learn more about the service, the customer service aspect at the end? I know open access is a big issue, and so I want to make sure I educate myself thoroughly on that. So I'm
be glad to start keeping you current with that.
Are there any FCC workshops that are held that includes that?
The FCC has pretty much decided to stay out of it. They've rattled a little bit of sabers. In summary, on the open net issue, the next real, I think, significant thing to happen will be the appeal of the Portland case. The federal judge in Portland agreed that the city had authority to restrict or require open access. That's on appeal. It's on a fast-track appeal, so I think that will be the next thing to hear. But the FCC chairman and some of the members have expressed concern going the other way, that they don't want 30,000 local governments addressing a broad telecommunications issue, and they've reserved authority. My opinion, not my best guess, is that I don't believe, I'll bet lunch that the open net issue is not on the table when we do our transfer. A year from now, I think it will have been decided by litigation or legislation.
Okay, anyone else? Okay, this end? Looks like,
Well, two quick questions. The OpenNet access, the OpenNet issue is one of providing, if it was AT&T, of them providing, like on local phone lines, other providers to come into the home and offer the service also. That's the question, right?
That's essentially it. Unbundling the connection and the internet content.
And your guess is that by the time this reaches us for action, that'll probably be decided in the courts?
Or by legislation.
Okay.
That's on the kind of the assumption that we may be dealing with a transfer first or second quarter next year. Between now and then, I think this will get resolved.
Just a quick question about a couple of dollars you mentioned. You said that the system has an estimated value of $1 billion. That would presumably be what AT&T is paying Comcast. But and you also stated that there are $130 million per year in gross revenues.
That's my best guess, yes.
Now that means that the system is worth roughly 8 times gross revenues. Is that right? That's a hell of a multiple. They're putting a huge premium on growth, I would presume. Is that typical in the industry?
Industry-wide now, average revenue per subscriber is in the high 30s, low 40s.
Per month?
Per month.
Yes.
$40 a month is not so much what you pay, but when you consider advertising revenue, the revenue from the home shopping, and all the other pieces. Average revenue is about $40 a month. As you roll forward, and Goldman Sachs and Dean Witter, Morgan Stanley and Dean Witter just did a big collective thing on this. When you add internet services at $40 a month, basic telephone services of long distance and basic dial tone of another $50 a month.
Growth based upon increased service capability.
The addition of, increased services brings you to revenue per subscriber and this is like 2003 for completed systems, between $130 and $140 a month. So the multiple gets a bit different.
Sounds like a pretty good stock investment. Yeah. That's impressive.
If it wasn't for those FPPC forms, it would be.
I had a question about the the standard that we're supposed to use in judging the transfer request. I understand the point you make about the clear and convincing standard that has to be borne by the party seeking to transfer, but if they make that showing, can we nonetheless reject the transfer? I mean, they have the burden to show that in order for us to approve the transfer, but do we have discretion upon their making such a showing to say no?
Veto power.
I think if they meet all the criteria by that showing, that you would be advised to approve the transfer.
And that formulation in the ordinance, is that something that's driven by some other body of law, or do we have, or does the county have the discretion to change the standard that exists in the underlying ordinance so that we would, for example, have the ability to reject a transfer notwithstanding the applicant's showing of clear and convincing evidence meeting the points enumerated in the ordinance?
The ordinance was adopted by all of the local entities that make up the commission, and you set the standards at that point. The commission has, and the local entities would have to go back and change it. You have the ability to change it. It's not, it would likely not apply to your existing franchise because the ordinance forms the basis of the rules under which that franchise is governed. And it's like a contract, and the ordinance is part of that contract. So I don't know that you could change, significantly change your transfer rules without negotiating that with your operator.
Okay. Are there, I mean, just sort of play this out one more step there. Are there any, from a policy standpoint, any advantages or disadvantages you see prospectively to changing the standard as currently enumerated in the ordinance? And I understand the procedural hurdles that we'd have to go through. We'd have to have each jurisdiction do it. But is there any, I mean, Rich mentioned in his opening remarks that the commission has been fairly aggressive in operationalizing whatever authority is given to it under existing federal law to regulate in this area. And I'm just wondering whether there is any utility to further expanding our discretion in reviewing these sorts of transfers, or whether that's a bad idea. Do you have any thoughts? I mean, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but
I think part of that depends, and I mean, I'd want to think about that, seriously, but I think that part of it depends on what you want from a cable operator. And, when you enter into a contract to provide cable service in this community, I don't know, I mean, I think what your ordinance does right now is it makes sure that if they transfer that, first you get a chance to look at who they're transferring it to, and you make sure that that new entity has the wherewithal to do that. And what you're looking for is really, do they have the wherewithal to do it, not necessarily whether it's Corporation A or B, but can Corporation B do as good a job as Corporation A? And that's what you already have in your ordinances. I don't know that the operation of a cable system is necessarily something like personal services where, there's a difference to whether I do the work or, somebody else does the work. I mean, I don't know if you're in that context. I don't know, once you enter into a franchise for a term, I think it's difficult to always have a full renegotiation every time you transfer. That would really be, I think, what you would be looking at if you went to broaden that out. And I'm not sure that federal law would allow you to do that.
to go that broad in any event. Okay.
And my reaction would be, we probably don't need it, just from kind of a layman's perspective, on a scale of 1 to 10 relative to transfer authority and oversight, we're probably an 8 or a 9, and most of the other franchises and documents that I see are a 3 or a 4. So from a staff perspective, our criteria and our process are about as strong as we need relative to the question that you've got. Making it broader, I don't know, would get us much more.
Okay. And then you, in your closing remarks, you mentioned as an additional regulatory issue the fees on all revenues. I don't understand that point.
Harry and I worked on legislation last year, AB 1614, which says that provision of high-speed services, internet services on a cable system, are subject to the license or franchise fees that are normally applicable to cable television until there's legislation or litigation which says otherwise. We think that language needs to be restated, or we would want that restated in a franchise transfer document as new services come online. I may be oversimplifying, but you've granted the cable company access to the streets and rights-of-way to build a cable system. And 18 years ago, you visualized a video cable system. Now the system has the ability to do a lot more beyond cable. And as it moves into telecommunication services, it's pretty fuzzy what counts from a standpoint of gross revenue. That's an item to be negotiated. If the cable company, if the telecommunications company decides to provide telephony on what is right now the physical wire of the cable system, do your fees apply to that or not? And that's an issue that we think needs to be discussed and needs to be addressed from Mr. Milo's perspective, that they potentially can double the gross if every subscriber took that service, and that's an assumption. So that's a question that we have to refine for you in evolving federal law with the state law that's on the books and whatever else comes along the way.
Okay, and then the last question is, I've been following the evolving debate about this OpenNet issue, and one thing that strikes me is apparently the FCC has submitted a friend of the court brief in the Portland case, in which the FCC chair has, or the FCC through that brief has posited some views about the ability of Portland as a local entity to regulate in this area. And they've done that without actually holding a regular FCC docket or hearing which would support the FCC taking that position. I guess as an advocate of decentralization and local control, I'm wondering whether there's anything we ought to be doing collectively as a body to impress upon the FCC that they ought to go through their procedure before they start weighing in this matter. I mean, it's one thing if they go through a docket and a hearing and all parties get to put forward their views and then the FCC makes a decision, but it's quite another if the FCC is jumping off into an arena against a local entity without having gone through that process, and I'm troubled by it. So is there anything that you could suggest to this commission that it might do by way of, assuming that's the collective view of this commission? That's another question, of course, but do we have the capacity to somehow express our views on this subject to the FCC?
Do we have the capacity? Yes. Would it be effective without a rulemaking open with the FCC? It would be a letter that you could write as an individual elected official, or if you agreed as a body, and that might be difficult because that would mean getting into the issues of the OpenNet, you could write a letter as well.
Not necessarily. I think I'm hearing him say that's not necessarily the issue. The issue is they've done this without a procedure.
Correct.
The procedure is what he's interested in. How can they do this without a procedure? That's a simpler issue to address. You don't have to get into how people feel about a net. But I think local governments feel very strongly about a procedural issue of feel the same way with the state legislature or Congress does the same thing without hearings. But
And I had the same concern when I was reviewing that
Okay,
issue.
well, it's certainly, you can certainly direct staff to prepare a letter from the chair addressing that issue. My comment was, coming back to, is the FCC doesn't have a proceeding open, so it's not like you're going to get into a particular process that would get recorded and published, et cetera. It would be an open letter to the secretary and or the chair. Be happy to draft one.
I mean, I don't know how the rest of the commission feels.
you
I
could CC
for
your
one,
delegation, your legislative delegation.
right. Now, I for one think it would be valuable to do that, and I'm not addressing the merits of the OpenNet issue one way or the other. I think that's something that we would reserve to deliberate on for another day. But as the chair said, I'm really focusing more on the procedural issue and the failure of the FCC to engage in a process that allows local governments like ours to weigh in one way or the other before they launch off against a local government. Do you need I don't know if you need a motion or if there's a...
Well, I think direction's good enough that at this point, because it's just a procedural
Right.
issue, so, okay. That was the end of your question?
That's it, thanks.
Okay. I had a question, or do you have any,
No.
Don? Okay. I have a question, and it gets back to that trying to make the findings issue, and particularly as it relates to, I thought the findings said something that related to the issue of service to customers, et cetera. In other words, this has to be a good deal for the community too, correct? I'm wondering, without rate regulation and the amount of money that would be used to purchase this service, to this system, and then if you think that there are going to be upgrades or any upgrades are promised, I mean, who's going to pay? And I think that who pays is a very important issue, because and how you, I suppose people could stretch out payments over a period of time, et cetera, but it seems to me that's going to be one of the tougher findings to make in terms of in the interests of the cable viewers. Are they going to have to pay for this whole thing? That obviously that's going to be a key component that I think is going to be difficult to look at in the findings. So I think that's something we have to think about too.
Yeah. Oh, I know that Rich and I have debated or discussed in the past upgrades to the system, and to the extent that the upgrades are being used for services other than cable TV, and the cable TV subscriber is paying for them, what the ramifications of that are. So I think that the issue that you pose will be an issue.
Okay, I guess that ends the questions on the part of the board members. We have two people from the public who want to speak, and then we have the one other item, because we said we had set this meeting for 2 items and 2 items only. So the Mr. Cooper and Liz Rhodes, and we're going to put the timer on, and anything after that you can give us in writing, because this is supposed to be a short meeting today. Okay?
Thank you,
Thanks.
Isla.
Mm-hmm.
Members of the Commission, Ron Cooper, Executive Director of Access Sacramento. First off, I want to share my appreciation in terms of the staff giving a very concise, pointed description of a very involved, long, complicated process. But I'd like to speak to one bullet that kept coming up throughout the process, even before all the process started, and that is the issue of community programming. Because throughout this entire process, over the matter now of more than 15 going on 20 years, this community and your predecessors and you as representatives of the community have steadfastly stood by community programming as a critical issue. And once again, as we said many times before, we appreciate that. And we have responded over that long history, over all of the frustration that went into that process, by providing community programming in public education, government, PBS involvement, religious coalition involvement, that is year after year after year recognized as the best in the nation. I'll say that again. Year after year after year is best in the nation. LA is jealous. San Francisco is jealous. The chaos that they have that Rich touched on is appalling. If I was an Angeline, I'd be embarrassed if I really understood the chaos down there. We are not chaotic and have been quite successful, and with your continued support will continue to be successful. Which brings me to this issue of the transfer agreement. From everything I heard said today, I absolutely agree with your staff's recommendation to stay focused on the transfer, and that the transfer brings more good than other options and alternatives. And that will be difficult, to stay focused on the transfer, having gone through this process, all of us together before. And it's even in black and white hard to follow on page 12 of your resolution agreement, which was decided upon in the Comcast transfer. Item number 6, the transaction will not detrimentally affect the public interest. Down 2/3 down the page there. In order to find that the transfer is in the public interest with respect to PEG access, the Commission hereby finds and determines the conditions are required that PEG access and service remain at least the level that it is today. Point 2, the current PEG channels will continue to be carried as part of the basic service tier, as that tier is currently defined. Well, we thought for those of us who got bumped to the 70s several years ago,
we thought that meant that we would stay in the lower channels. So you can see as technology changes, as former Supervisor Dave Cox says, that was a community promise that was broken. Okay? It was clever, but it was broken. So it's really important that we do stay focused and stay on top of this. And just in conclusion, why is it important in terms of access speed to the internet? I attended a national conference recently, and it became very clear why that's important. If a internet provider allows blazing speed to only select websites, then all of the production and planning that we are doing as community programmers to put our channels on the web to be seen and enjoyed by the world, that would be an exciting opportunity, may in fact be restricted to, as they call, CLV, crummy little video that you see right now. So that's why it's important, and we'll be following this closely as this becomes involved, because we want our websites representing Sacramento to move at blazing fast speed and to be active participants on the net. So I appreciate
Thank you
your
very
focus.
much, Ron.
Thank you.
I have one question. I have one question before you leave.
You're going to question the speaker. Oh, okay.
Speaker, I'm
Thank you.
sorry.
Yeah.
Did you get the issue worked out with the show on the issue that you had?
Yes, the gentleman still has not provided a verifiable address, and in fact the P.O. box has now been closed, so therefore that program has not run. Thank you.
Thank you. Liz Rhodes?
Good afternoon. I'm Liz Rhodes, Executive Director of the Sacramento Educational Cable Consortium. Just real quickly, the educational community has been involved in this process since day one, and educational cable is a backbone in our community. We would like to continue to be involved in this process, and we very much appreciated the opportunity that we had in the last transfer to work with Rich, and would like to thank you for that opportunity and request that we have that same opportunity to be an active participant and to offer our services in this transfer too. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Liz. Okay, and the last speaker on item 1, Joyce Christensen. Hello.
I just wanted to, my name is Joyce Christensen, and I'm the president of the Children's Media Forum, but I work a lot with elder seniors throughout the area. And I just wanted to comment that when you really, if this issue isn't solved before the policy is made, something that I'm finding more and more with the elder seniors is that they're becoming very dependent upon the internet. They're finally deciding that you don't have to be really technology conscious, and that you're able to do a lot of different things with it. So the seniors now are utilizing the internet for shopping issues and corresponding with their families, and they're finding that it's really a lifeline, something that could be really positive and great for them, and they're accepting the fact that they can delve in on the technology. So I'm hoping when the issues are finally brought about, if it's not solved before everything is completed, that you really take into consideration the open access so that they do have their choices. Because with seniors right now, there's so many that are on fixed incomes and so on, that they truly need to be able to know that they're going to be able to afford to stay within the technology issue. So I just thought I'd comment on that because I'm very strong with the seniors.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you very much. And we'll move on then to action item 2, which is the affirmative action plan. And Ken is here from the city of Sacramento. Hi, Ken.
Good afternoon to the commissioners. My name is Ken Fleming, Administrative Service Manager with the City of Sacramento. This afternoon we're giving a report back following up on the AA plan submitted by Comcast Corporation. I've prepared a memo that basically summarizes my findings. I'll just highlight some of the significant areas relative to our review of Comcast's affirmative action plan. The results from the prior year plan indicated that there was some slippage in the representation of minorities and females in 2 categories, officials and managers and professionals. Minorities and officials and managers went from 21.1% down to 19.2%, and for females 42.1% to 38.5%. In the professional categories, minorities from 23.5% to 17.4%, and for females from 70.6% to 60.9. Also a slight decrease in the level of female representation for technicians and office clerical, and there it was not as significant, from 9.8 to 8.2 in the technician category, and from 54.8 to 53.7 in the office clerical category. All other categories showed increases, and there were significant increases in the craft category for minorities, where they went from 15.2% to 31.6%. And in the operative categories, they went from 40% to 47.8%. In the dissemination of policy section, I think it's of note that the EEO and affirmative action issues are considerations in the performance evaluations of managers. And in my opinion, that shows accountability, and it shows commitment to the process, that in the evaluations and performance evaluations of managers, that these factors are considered. So I think to have that particular piece in the operational practices. The job availability and underutilization analysis showed that minorities were underutilized in professionals, technicians, and craft workers, but the professional underutilization is not really significant. Females are underutilized for officials, managers, technicians, craft workers, and operatives, and the underutilization in the officials, managers, and craft workers categories are not viewed as being significant. Overall, the underutilization show that there's a need for increased effort in the Asian and American Indian categories. The other categories appear to be at an acceptable level. And the established goals, we believe, are reasonable and appropriate. There was also, in the problem areas, an identification of a problem relative to the minority termination rate, and we believe that there is a need to continue monitoring that particular activity. However, we feel that the procedures that they currently have in place are sufficient to ensure continuing monitoring and make any necessary adjustments to practices and policies that may impact that particular issue. The overall findings basically show that the recommendations that we made from last year in our review have been implemented, and I believe that they are making a good faith effort to accomplish the program goals. The Commission also made a request relative to Section 5.75.416 of your licensing ordinance, which was referred to earlier, and that particular ordinance, or a section of the ordinance, basically deals with the affirmative action. And the particular language of the ordinance requires that no licensee shall discriminate in employment or selection of contractors or subcontractors. And it additionally requires them to comply with EEO laws relative to FCC, any federal, state, or county or city ordinance relative to equal employment opportunity. I did some research into a number of regulations, federal and state, and basically the plan that Comcast has developed is a plan that was developed in line with Executive Order 11246 and Revised Order Number 4. Executive Order 11246 was implemented by President Johnson, and the revised order is basically a guidance from the Labor Department that sets out the particular components for contractors to utilize in their plans to comply with the executive order. We also looked at a number of additional requirements there. The purpose of those specific programs that are developed in relation to Executive Order 11246 is set out in 41 CFR Part 62 at Section 62.10. And I'd like to just quote specifically some of the language that's in that particular section. It states, quote, an affirmative action program is a set of specific and result-oriented procedures to which a contractor commits itself to apply every good faith effort. The objective of those procedures plus such efforts is equal employment opportunity. Procedures without effort to make them work are meaningless, and efforts undirected by specific and meaningful procedures is inadequate. The The plan that is developed by Comcast is simply an equal opportunity program, and it sets out their policies and procedures to ensure equal opportunity within their operation. The requirements that are set in the licensing ordinance, I believe, kind of parallel a number of the regulations that I reviewed in this process, and they're basically your method of ensuring that the licensee does not discriminate and is in fact an equal opportunity employer. I believe that this question initially arose because the form in which we are ensuring that Comcast is an equal opportunity employer, and that is through their affirmative action plan, varies somewhat from the submission that they make to the FCC. The FCC only requires that they provide workforce information. Again, the overall purpose of both processes is to ensure that they are an equal opportunity employer. We are willing to work with staff in any way that this commission would see fit to make this process as less burdensome to them as possible in order to ensure a thorough review of their practices. And we can take direction from you as to how you would like to see that done, and we can work with staff to discuss that and come back at a later date with some issues. The bottom line is we feel that the license ordinance, again, which gives you the ability to ensure that the licensee is an equal opportunity employer as it relates to employment as well as contracting, does not need to be changed. Mr. Shelby indicated with a lot of the direction in terms of this area, many people are focusing on terminology, and they use the term equal employment opportunity. That is something that you may consider. However, affirmative action is still something that is mandated by federal law, and the purpose, again, as I mentioned earlier, of affirmative action is to ensure equal opportunity. So I believe, as written, your license ordinance is okay. Additionally, this particular process is simply the method by which this commission reviews the performance of the contractor to ensure that they are an equal opportunity employer. And again, I do not see that there's a problem with that. We would ask that you receive and file this report, and if there are any questions, I'd be more than happy to respond to those.
Just the one, in terms of the second page, just to correct that, because it says adequate, and I think it means inadequate at the very last one.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so with that correction,
Okay.
on page 2, because it's a part of our record, correct? Okay.
Correct.
Page 3.
Is it page 3? Yeah, it's right before Ken's signature. It's right at the top of the page. It's the quote, and there was a typo there. It should have said undirected by specific and meaningful procedures is inadequate.
That's
Yeah,
correct.
so, okay. Anybody have questions? Yeah, James.
Just a couple of questions. One, you talked about process, and I think I believe that you're the expert in terms of the reporting, and I think I would depend on you to present to us something that, so we could look at the information and make sure that what we're trying to achieve is achieved. And is it possible to include in your report the numbers that you review so that when we look at what is inadequate, because in my opinion, I think there is a correlation between underutilization of managers and termination of minorities. So if you could somewhere include that, the review that you do, so that we get it, we can look at the numbers as it relates to your review, and it would just be helpful to me in terms of following it through.
Mr. Shelby, just to help, the report came last month and you weren't here,
Right.
so it's flagged with a tab in your binder. And this is a summary.
That's the one that Ken reviews.
That was the source document that Ken was using.
That's
So
correct.
you have some of the data there.
But I guess my point was his comments are separate from that, and if you could tie the two together, it would be more helpful.
We can do that.
Okay, any other questions?
One other question.
David?
I don't know if this thing's on or not. This goes back to what Commissioner Shelby asked earlier, which had to do with our ability to monitor how well contractors are doing in this area. And I think the answer was a prior commission negotiated away some authority to review that particular item. I'm not sure I understood your answer entirely to his follow-up question, though. Is this something that we have given away, or the prior commission gave away for all time, or is it just given away with regard to this particular franchisee? Or, you know, I want to push a little bit and ask whether we may, in this particular area, resume monitoring what's happening with regard to contractors.
Your licensing ordinance provides that the licensee, and Comcast is a licensee as well as franchisee, can't discriminate in the selection of contractors or subcontractors. You would have the ability to monitor that. I think what was given away before, I mean, that was before my time, but my understanding of what was given away was more of the traditional DBE, WBE type of affirmative obligation to contract with minority and women-owned businesses. So the part that was contracted away, that was given away as part of the settlements, was more of the older, prior affirmative obligation to hire, to have a certain percentage of the subcontractors, so to speak, be minority or women subcontractors. You still have, just as you do in employment, you still have the non-discrimination provisions for subcontracting, and you could monitor that if you wanted to.
I'd like to explore that. I mean, we don't have the time now, but I share Commissioner Shelby's interest in this regard, and I'm wondering if in our next meeting you could bring forward some sort of a staff report or recommendation on how we might do that sort of monitoring.
If I could comment on that, I think this body has a right and a responsibility to ensure that there is equal opportunity, not only in employment, but contracting. I think the issue of contracting, though, as Ms. Steiner indicated, is a little more thornier issue with some of the recent legislative developments. And so how you approach that from a commission standpoint, I think is very important and may be limited to some degree by some of the recent developments in that area.
Well, if you all could give us your best, I think that would be helpful. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much, Ken. We have no further business before this commission, and no further questions for staff. Okay, then we are adjourned. Thank you very, very much.